Welcome to the Stories of Northern Life podcast. I am your current host, Nicole, and I am the collections assistant at the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. If you listened to our episode last week, you will have heard an interview with Mari. She is the one who created this podcast and was a host for almost 2 years. So if you would like to give it a listen and send her all of your good wishes, she is setting off on a very exciting adventure, and we wish her all the very best. Today, I am going to read you an article that was published in the Sault Daily Star on February 24th, 1924. And as I am reading this article, there are a couple words or even whole sentences that might be a little off, as the copy of this article that we have is not the clearest, so we have done our best to try to make out these words. And also some of the terminology that is used is a little bit outdated, so I just want to give a content warning that there might be some language that might be difficult for some listeners. So this article is entitled "The First Words Written About the Sioux." So this really intrigued me to see what the first words that they found written about the Sioux and what they had to say about it 100 years ago. So here is the article. The first words written about the Sioux. The first book in which there is a definite reference to the Sioux is Le Grand Voyage du Pays des Hurons, The Great Journey to the Huron Country, by Gabriel Sagard Theodat, a lay brother of the Recollect Order. The journey was made in 1632 by way of the Ottawa River, French River, and here is where one line of the text is lost. It's sort of blacked out in the photocopy of the article that we have. But what we can make out is Lake Tracy, which is one of the historic names for Lake Superior. And the second part of the line reads what we think is Brother Sagard stayed in. Then the article continues on. Huronia, south of the Georgian Bay, about 10 months. His book was printed in 1632. It was in the same year that Champlain issued the revised edition of his voyages and explorations. Champlain and Brother Sagard apparently wrote to satisfy the public demand in France for information about that mysterious and shadowy land on the other side of the world, New France. 4 years later, in 1636, so great had the success of the Grand Voyage, Sagard brought out his Histoire du Canada in 4 volumes, dealing with New France from 1615 till 1629, when the English took Quebec. It is mostly about the Indians and rehashes some of the Grand Voyage. Champlain's voyages have been translated into English by the Prince Society, whose elaborate volumes are not available to the public. The 1632 revised edition was issued independently in 1911, but so much is left out of this book that it is very unsatisfying to an Algoma man. Lavendier's edition in France is by all odds the best modern edition of Champlain. It is quite rare. Sagard has never been translated, and so the English reader who wishes to delve into the fascinating story of the Indians and voyageurs in the Great Lake country 300 years ago is forced to tackle the Old French, in which the letter U is used for V and F does the duty for S. The Star's copies were dug up in a bookshop in Paris, which specializes in rare books. In those days, literary ethics did not prevent two very good men apparently using each other's stuff without credit. For instance, Champlain lifted Sagard's description of the Sioux and garbled it, and Sagard took whole pages out of Champlain's voyages, and the reader only discovers the, quote, loans when he finds the original sources. Nowadays, a writer may not even put an idea to the same general form without running the risk of criticism. So that in those days, a writer was not always the author of much that appeared in his work. Apparently, Brother Sagard's appropriation of Champlain's pages shows that he endorsed the sentiments expressed. Sagard always referred to Étienne Brûlé as le truchement brûlé, or simply le truchement, the interpreter. He spells Grenol's name with one or two L's as he feels like it, and he never gives the first name of either. Grenol was to him only an ordinary white man, and Brûlé was thrown in his way a little more. Yet Brother Gabriel's books reflect the hardihood and venturesome life of the pair. Just as a mere aside is the visit to the Sioux and the Lake Superior copper mine mentioned. Incidentally, too, is Brûlé shown in the brother's cabin, doubtless instructing him in Huron and giving him much of the material we get in the Grand Voyage and the Histoire. No question at all, but Brûlé and Grenol are the authorities for some of the interesting things in these books, because Sagard himself was only 10 months in Huronia and came entirely ignorant of the language. In these days, you were not allowed to print anything without the permission, and Sagard's privilège du roi, the king's permission, was signed at Paris on July 21st, 1632 by Huvat for the council. On July 29th, Sagard gave Denis Moreau, the printer, an agreement accepting him as the publisher. Then, on August 10th, the first copy was printed. The book was apparently in type before these preliminaries were observed. Here are the exact words about the first mention of the Sioux on page 644 of Sagard's original edition, the French accents being omitted. Le truchement brûlé année quelques sauvages nous effectuent qu'au-delà de la mer Douce, il y a une autre grandissime lac qui fait des charges d'un icelle par un chute d'eau long à Furninkim, le saut de Gaston ayant près de 2 lieues de large, lequel lac, avec la mer Douce, contient environ 30 journées de canot selon le rapportage des sauvages, et du truchement 400 lieues de longueur. This translation is submitted. Interpreter Brûlé, with some savages, have assured us that above the freshwater sea, Lake Huron, there is another very great lake which discharges into it by a waterfall, which they have named Sault de Gaston, nearly 2 leagues wide, which lake with the freshwater sea takes about 30 days canoe travel according to the report of the savages, and the interpreter 400 leagues in length. The relations tell us that the Hurons called all the lakes on terre except Superior, which they knew as Aquafenende. It seems evident that Brother Sagard could have known more about Superior had he taken the trouble to inquire. For years before Champlain had given a good description of Algoma, its rocks, its trees, its rivers, its blueberries, its raspberries, its mooses, its climate, and its people, a description which cannot be mistaken. And why didn't Brother Sagard lift some of this and add to it? So there is our article from the Sioux Daily Star on February 24th, 1924. As you could see, some of the French that was taken from Sagard's original book was a little bit hard to make out. One, because we didn't have the exact quote in front of us to take that from. So, as they were taking the French out of the book, there might have been some spelling errors and that they had copied over, making it more difficult to understand. And also, we are taking this spelling as well from an article that is a photocopy of the original newspaper. So that is another barrier to this. But the translation we have is fairly clear. They're talking about the Sioux, and where they mention the waterfall, they are actually referring to the rapids. So in French, they actually use the same word to describe a type of what you would call maybe like a waterfall or a drop in water. So a waterfall is where you can think of the water going from one height dropping down to another height. And the rapids are the same thing. You're taking one lake that is at one level going into another river or lake that is at a lower level. And it's not a steep drop like you have a waterfall, but it is still a big drop over rocks that create sort of that rough water. And so that's what Sault means. And so that's where we get Sault Ste. Marie or Sault Ste. Marie. It is referring to the rapids of St. Mary or the Virgin Mary. That name was given to the Sioux by the Jesuits, but before that it was called Sault de Gaston, and that name was given by Etienne Bourlet. But as we know, the original name for Sault Ste. Marie is Bawading, and Bawading also means place of the rapids. So as you can see with the name of our wonderful town, we have a lot of mentions to rapids. So it seems pretty interesting that the first real mention that we have of the Sioux is basically describing our rapids and our area, and that all the names that have been given to our area have all been referring to our rapids. So I think our rapids are a pretty important part to our area. Stay tuned. Keep following the Sioux Museum at Sioux Museum on all our socials, and I will have another episode out for you next week. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm J.L. Fizzell, and I write and publish poetry inspired by nature and the art of being human. These are some of my words. The poem I'm about to read for you is from my third book, North of Dreams, and it has to do with the idea of persistence and resilience, and it's inspired by Lake Superior. It's called She Who Is Water. Waves thrash against shorelines until they make change, sometimes slow and gentle, sometimes hard and fast, but their actions, regardless of their speed, always shape the things they touch. I hope that this poem took you somewhere inside yourself that you needed to go. You can listen to my story here on the Stories of Northern Life podcast. Links are in the show notes.